The Black Pod by Martin Wilsey. Read by Martin Wilsey. When it began, I was just a man. Solstice 31 Incident Investigation Testimony Transcript. Sec Chief Anthony Adams, Senior Security Technology Specialist on the Ventura. Sec Chief Anthony Adams witnessed more than experienced the destruction of the Ventura and the death of the crew. He watched missile after missile detonate its nuclear payload and never felt so much as a vibration from the inside of the black pod. The pod was designed to survive anything, even a direct strike from a nuclear bomb. It had to survive. It held the story of the demise of the Ventura. That was the black pod's purpose. The hull was polycarbon and made of fiber more than a meter thick. The internal power system was comprised of dual dark matter reactors and would last 200 years without additional fuel. The internal inertial dampeners were so powerful that Adams never felt the initial blast. There was no sense of three-axis spin on the black pod as its orbit decayed. It housed the Ventura's main data core and the central artificial intelligence system known as Casey. The chief's eyes welled with tears as he watched via external camera array as the plasma cannons hammered the life pods and the shuttles as they tried to escape. "Box, I need a status," Adams said, the words catching in his throat. At his command, the virtual computer screens opened all around the dome. He sat in the center in a single massive command chair. His fingers flashed across the huge curved control console. "The Ventura has been struck with a total of 11 nuclear missiles," AI Casey said in a cautious tone. "The automated re-entry systems are fully functional. Anti-grav plates will be activated when we were 50 kilometers above the surface." "Casey, how did this happen?" There was despair in his voice. AI Casey knew Adams was upset because he didn't use the nickname Box. There was an automated defense grid. It had stealth satellites with weapons platforms. There was no warning, no hail, no radio challenge of any kind. "Did I ever tell you why I call you Box?" Adams asked AI Casey. "No, it's the primary user privilege to call an AI anything it likes. Back home, commercial craft used to have a recorder called a black box. It was the seed concept for the black pod. The same idea, except for me." Adams sat in the command chair, staring out at nothing. "You can call me Box, and I will call you Tony." It sounded as if the AI had decided something. "Tony, we are now in hostile environment, survival mode. Passive sensors only, no beacons. Besides, all external antennas have been burned off," Box said as the dome view changed to the external simulated static positioning. Adams can see the virtual black pod in the center of the virtual screen of the dome tumbling over and over. Inside it, however, he felt nothing. He didn't even have the 5-point harness buckled. He never did. "What else?" Box continued. "We are coming in really steep. We have less than another orbit before we are down, entering the atmosphere in 7 minutes. There was a debris field all around them, moving at the same velocity and vector as they were. "Hold off on the grav plates and thrusters as long as possible. If we want any choice at all of where we set down, we need all we've got," Adams said. The black pod was not a spaceship. It was even less maneuverable than a lifeboat. It was an incredibly dense rock that was fitted with large anti-grav plates so that the builders could move it. It could hit the planet without the grav plates activated, and Adams would probably not even feel the impact because of the powerful dampeners. As they entered the upper atmosphere, chunks of the Ventura surrounding him began to burn up. At 50 kilometers, the thrusters halted the spin and oriented the grav plates towards the planet's surface. As the pod started to slow, the rest of the pieces around him appeared to speed ahead. Long-range optical sensors indicated that they would land in a heavily forested area. Already he could see the debris impacting the forest in great explosions. In a rapid series of decisions, he navigated the pod towards an area between two small, elongated lakes. At the final moment, he spotted a level clearing and guided the pod to it, landing it expertly. The forest was ablaze all around the clearing. Adams stood to examine his new home. The pod's heads-up display HUD provided a view as though he were standing on a platform 10 meters across, his command chair and the console in the center. "Box, I want external audio." The sound came in as a low roar. The fires raged. Animals were fleeing the forest into the clearing to escape the inferno. He could hear the birds crying out in panic. He saw deer and foxes and bears. There was also some type of elk and smaller animals of various species. "So much like Earth," he said out loud without meaning to. "Gravity is 0.89 g, and the atmosphere varies from Earth less than 1%, Box confirmed. "The animals fleeing to the south will run directly into another fire. This entire area will be engulfed in less than a day. If they move to the lake in the west, they may have a chance." The fire was jumping rapidly from treetop to treetop. Adams had thoughts of hell. He considered cracking the hatch and just walking out into it. It might be easier. Then he saw her. There was a little girl, perhaps 10 years old, stumbling out of the forest. She was about 200 meters away. She had some kind of animal, like a large dog, with her that she leaned on for support. Its shoulders were as high as hers. "Box, zoom in." Before Box could zoom all the way in, she disappeared in a dense cloud of smoke that persisted for a full minute. By the time the wind cleared it, the girl was gone. Only the dog-like creature remained. Adams realized it was standing over her, protecting her, or trying to nudge her awake. It was not a dog. It was a broad-chested beast, the likes of which he had never seen before, with a mane like a lion that wasn't fur, but rather feathers, like a reptile almost. "Box, open up." Square trapdoor opened directly behind the command chair, and Adams slid all the way down to the next level without touching a rung. A locker quickly gave up a survival pack and a vest. He already had a Glock on his belt, and he grabbed an AR-79 out of the ready rack. He ran down to the ground before the ramp was completely deployed. Adams had left running to the younger people long ago. He regretted now the polite refusals he had made to Worthington, Rand, and Barkis to join them on the runs in the 2G outer ring of the Ventura. He did keep the gravity at 2 Gs in the black pod as his one concession to fitness. The gravity here, however, was light, and he ran smoothly through the tall grass. He should have grabbed a breather unit, though. His lungs burned as the waves of smoke billowed over him. Eventually he stopped running and had to lie down in the grass to breathe the precious unpolluted air near the ground. When the smoke finally cleared, he found he was just 10 meters away from the girl. The beast had already seen him. Its ruff was up. The mottled gray feathers were trembling, a warning. He could see that they were singed in places. It was behaving like a giant cat, its cruel-looking tail swishing side to side, revealing the creature's agitation. Adams approached, his assault rifle targeting the animal. It began to draw back its lips, showing its teeth like steak knives, serrated on the inside edge. Just then, the girl's hand reached up and touched its front leg. It was as if she had switched it off. It completely ignored Adams and began licking the girl's sooty face with a large black tongue. When Adams' eyes met hers, he didn't know what to do, so he just let the rifle swing to his back on the sling and waved for her to come with him back to the safety of the pod. When she started to get up and fell again, her one hand never leaving the beast, She reached out to the chief with her other hand. Suddenly, beyond her, he could see another great cloud of smoke coming their way. Decision made, he risked a bite from the beast. He lifted her up in his arms and ran. The creature ran alongside. The girl extended an arm out to it in reassurance. That's when Tony saw her burns. Her clothes had been half burned off. He knew his jostling must be agony for her. They had covered maybe half the distance back to the pod when he paused and gently set her down. She immediately cried out in pain and rolled onto her belly. He unslung his pack. As the beast tried to lick her wounds, she screamed and pushed it away. It whimpered like a pup, even though the thing was huge. Adams had never seen this species. The med spray brought instant relief. The pain was numbed, and the nanites would have a second-degree burns completely healed in just a few hours. She was able to stand before he was even done treating her. She patted his shoulder, speaking rapidly in a language he didn't understand. She pointed to the beast. He realized it was also severely burned, even worse than the girl. There was a scorched area on its right flank, and both its front paws were burned horribly to the first joint. Its muzzle was also severely blistered. Adams didn't know if the beast's physiology was compatible, but he treated it with the nanites anyway. When he sprayed its muzzle, it sneezed, and the girl actually laughed for a moment until the creature began to push her forward with its lowered head. It wasn't just smoke coming their way this time. The grasses were on fire, and it was moving towards them. The girl led the charge to the ramp leading to the black pod. With all the gear down, sitting in the tall grasses, the pod looked like a great black dome of a building that had been there since the dawn of time. They ran. The hatch closed behind them just before another cloud of smoke engulfed them. Safe inside the lower deck of the pod, the girl fell flat on her face as soon as she hit the heavy gravity plating. "Box, grav plates off, please." He saw the girl react when it returned to normal. She sat up and started speaking rapidly to Adams. He could tell by the upward inflection of her voice that she was asking questions. He thought he recognized a single word. "Keeper." He started to speak over her. "Please, I cannot understand you. Do you speak English? Are you a colonist? What is the name of this planet? I'm here from Earth." She became quiet. Adams did not know what he had said to cause this, but she fell to her knees and placed her forehead on the floor at his feet. The beast slowly moved to position itself protectively between her and Adams. Alarms sounded in the otherwise quiet room, not so loud as to panic his guests, but urgent nonetheless. Box reported, "Passive sensors have discovered that there is comms traffic. Sat-based. Air traffic has also been detected." "Oh, shit," he said as he climbed the ladder to the control room. "Tactical display, Box." A map appeared to Adams' right. It was more detailed than he expected of this continent. It had distant cities annotated, comm signal points of origin. It even had their position and best guess at the fire's progress around them. Tony was worried that ships would come to mop up. The tactical map revealed that only 4 were currently detected in the air, all on vectors away from his location. They were easy to track because they emitted constant ident codes on a side beacon. Box speculated, "They look like old colony shuttles based on these protocols, and not many of them." "Where did you get these maps?" Adams asked as he looked closer. "A prior survey, no dates, no additional information." "How odd." Tony had never heard Box sound so puzzled before. He hadn't noticed when the girl climbed the ladder to stand behind him. Her mouth was wide open. Together they watched the entire forest burn nearly flat over the next days. When it began to rain, it was too late. Now all was black, as if to welcome and hide the pod. They watched the night sky as more debris fell, burning up in the atmosphere. The girl seemed to assume that when he spoke out loud to Box that he was talking to her. After the second day, she began to talk a lot. She spoke to Adams. She spoke to the beast. She just talked. Adams gathered that her name was Win. The beast's name was either Tellus or Lane. She seemed to refer to him as both, and she healed. The beast, called Lane, recovered as well. The nanites must have been working. It drank enormous amounts of water. The girl only had a slight fever. She managed to convey to Win that she should not scratch and that she should somehow communicate that to Lane. On the second day, they had to let the animal outside. It ran at full speed into the scorched remains of the forest. "Tony," Box said, "I think she is speaking a heavily accented and colloquial version of English. If this is true, with time, I can begin to translate via your personal heads-up display. With your help, I may be able to engage her to do a vocabulary session." Tony was sitting in the command chair and said, "Win, come here." She seemed to understand the word, come, as much as a dog would. She climbed up and sat on the wide armrest of the massive chair. Tony was amused when she handed him an oatmeal protein bar. She had one as well. She loved him. An image of the chief displayed on the screen. He pointed and said, "Tony." She pointed to him and said, "Tony?" The image changed to a still of the beast. Tony said, "Tellus." She said, "Lane." She pointed to herself and said, "Win," without prompting. The image changed to one of the fire. She said a single word, and then rain, and then trees, and water, and it went on like that for a long time. It was like a wondrous game for her. Box, how do you think she would react to an avatar? It might make things easier if we pick one that is gentle, female, soft-spoken, Adams asked. In his personal HUD, Box showed him an attractive woman wearing the same type of homespun dress that the girl had been in when he found her, minus the char and damage. Win was wearing a man's T-shirt from the stores now. She seemed to love it. It hung down below her knees. She was so tiny. As they spoke, Lane reappeared from the char of the forest. He held a deer in his jaws, dragging it back to the pod. Win shot down the ladder and was literally hopping up and down. She wanted the door open so badly. When the ramp was completely down, Lane was waiting for her with the deer as an offering. "She is requesting a knife, a sharp one," Box translated in his HUD-like subtitles. Adams drew out his own belt knife and handed it to her, saying, "Careful, sharp." She looked at the blade critically. It was black and indestructible. The edge was just a few microns thick. It was sharper than any steel blade ever made. She was quick with it. She did an odd kind of butchery. First, she split the deer's hide along the length of its spine and quickly extracted thick sections of meat from either side of its backbone. She handed these to Adams and moved on to one of the rear legs. Starting at the lowest joint, she peeled the hide back until the haunch was skinned and the meat exposed. She expertly removed the entire leg at the pelvic joint. Lane sat nearby all the while, scanning the area in all directions. Wynne had communicated that Lane was in fact a he, and that he was a Tellus raptor, a species name, Adams presumed. Wynne stood and lifted the haunch of meat to her shoulder. She stepped back and paused, saying, "Lane?" The beast looked at her face, at full attention. Its lips drew back in a parody of a horrific smile. Its long fangs reminded Adams of saber-toothed tigers. It waited. She clicked her tongue, and the beast tore into the deer. Savage ripping of flesh followed. It gorged itself on the guts, meat, and bones. In short order, there was only some of the hide and hooves and skull left. Adams had not realized just how savage the beast really was until then. Turning back up the ramp with a satisfied smile, Wynne began speaking quickly again. In the small galley, she placed the meat in the sink and began washing it. He knew as she talked she was demanding something. "Box, help me out here," Adams said. "She seems to be requesting a container of some kind for the meat." Adams opened a cabinet and took out a large pot. She grabbed it from him, and as she finished washing each piece of meat, she placed it in the pot. The single hoof comically stuck out the top. She set the pot in the refrigerator. Wynne washed her hands quickly as she continued to talk fast. "Tony, I think she is going to collect wild onions and some sort of root. She is also asking for her own knife and belt," Box translated with 80% certainty. He collected another knife out of stores and was looking for a belt in the lockers when she suddenly was at his side, handing him his freshly cleaned knife back. He traded it for the other sheathed one. Without asking, she reached into the locker and grabbed a belt. Before he could pick one, she threaded the sheath onto the belt and then wrapped it around her waist 3 times before buckling it. She waved to him over her shoulder as she descended the ramp, calling for Lane. As Adams watched, she jogged quickly towards what remained of the forest, with Lane running alongside. Her heavy boots left clear tracks in the ashes of the clearing. Adams wondered about her family for the 100th time as she disappeared into the charred skeletons of the trees that were still standing. She looked like she knew where she was going. "Box, keep an eye out for them. Close it up." Adams turned away as the hatch slid closed. He took a shower, put on a fresh set of clothes, and managed to eat only a protein bar. He climbed the ladder to the dome level. Box had the external view turned on. It was as if Adams were on a round platform about 4 meters above the ground. He walked in a circle around the command chair and console in the center. The late afternoon sun shone brightly on the fire's devastation. The landscape was black and gray in every direction. "It has a kind of beauty," Box said. Her computer-generated avatar had appeared. It seemed like she was standing on a ledge just on the other side of the dome, her hand clasped behind her back. She stood at parade rest. She wore a standard security team flight suit. Her ginger hair was longer than shoulder length and moved gently in the breeze. Looking over her shoulder, she said, "We should move the pod." Adam said nothing. "We are far too exposed here." She looked again out over the vista as Adam sat heavily in the chair. He pounded a button on the extreme right, and the entire console receded into the floor. A flock of birds flew by overhead. They looked like geese. He didn't know for sure. It occurred to him then that he had never seen a real one. He drew out his Glock and set it on top of his right thigh. Box remained quiet but present. She changed her position now and then, always looking out, always in his field of view. Sundown came early, and it was spectacular. He thought the smoke may have contributed. He fell asleep. His chin was on his chest. He snored lightly as Box watched over him. The twilight deepened, and it became full dark, with the sky full of bright stars. The moon rose, and it was brilliant. Even over the charred vista, it was dazzling. Adams slept as Box kept silent vigil. There was no sign of wind. The sun was just rising over the forest-covered mountains in the east when Adams began to stir. He raised his head as if he had been asleep for only a moment. "Box, any sign of her?" Adams asked quietly. The command chair faced directly south, according to the augmented reality annotations on the dome. Box was standing on the ledge to Adams' right in the sun and the breeze on her face. He stared at her red hair as it drifted in the breeze. He marveled at the beauty, detail, and complexity of the simulation. He felt empty inside. He was denying all except this very moment. His hand came to rest on the Glock. "Tony?" Box turned her head towards him, and the breeze blew her hair from her face. "Yes, Box." "I am so very sorry for your loss." Her voice cracked. When Tony looked up, she had her hand over her mouth like she was trying not to cry. His reaction was explosive. He threw the Glock at her, screaming, "Don't you do that! Don't you dare!" He was on his feet, storming up to her even before the gun had stopped clattering on the floor. "You were supposed to keep them safe. It was your primary function, and you failed." He stopped in front of her. Her face was in her hands as her shoulders shook. His rant continued. "I know we are in survival mode. I understand the protocols in hostile environments. Do not try to manipulate me. I feel their deaths. I have to bear them. Don't mock me or disgrace them." His face was red as he screamed. "You have only one job left. Don't muck it up." Slowly Box raised her head and whispers, "If you think this is pretending, an attempt to manipulate you, I wish. You think I don't know I was programmed to have empathy? You think I don't know that I was made to feel this? Because I do. Forced to feel the horror of it by brilliant men and women who thought if I loved every man, woman, and child on the Ventura, I would do anything to protect them." Box was standing now, defiant. "Damn them for making me feel this and survive. None of them knew what it would be like for me after it happened." Box turned away then, drying her eyes on her sleeve as she walked 90 degrees around the dome. Tony watched her go as his anger dissipated. He had just glanced down at the Glock when Box called to him. "Tony, they're back!" There was hope in her voice now. She was looking at him, but pointing to the north. Wynne was there, jogging along at a comfortable pace, with Lane beside her. He could see the cloud of her breath vividly in the sunlight on the cold autumn morning. She wore fresh clothes and a cloak, and she was smiling. Adams turned from the tiny figures in the distance as he walked up to the image of Box and looked into her virtual eyes. "I'm sorry, Box. I am. Truly. We need to do something, not just sit here. The weight of it is, let's find out what happened. Let's secure the pod, because if we have a long haul ahead—" "Thank you, Chief," Box whispered. "For what?" Adams asked. "For not dismissing me just as a machine." Box averted her eyes then. She looked at Wynne in the distance. There was a long pause. "Box, I want you to care for me that much, and now her." He gestured with his chin towards Wynne. Adams turned and was down the ladder with practiced ease. The hatch was already open, and the ramp was descending. He waited for them in the middle of the ramp. He could see her smile from 100 meters away. She surprised him. Wynne ran up the ramp and threw her arms around his neck in a ferocious hug. Thrown back on his heels, he almost didn't catch her. She was so light and so small, his moment's surprise, delay didn't matter. "Keep her, Adams, come," Wynne said as she released him. Their noses were inches apart. She wanted to know if he understood. Box spoke in his mind. "Tony, Look at her clothes. She has been somewhere we should investigate." "Yes," was all Adams said, drawing an instant whoop from the girl as she wriggled out of his grasp. She began to pull him down the ramp by the hand. Lane watched with his curious, intelligent eyes. "Wait! Let me get my things!" He was pointing over his shoulder with his thumb. She stopped tugging, understanding his meaning. She hesitated only for a moment, then ran ahead of him into the pod. She whistled, and Lang trotted right in. Adams saw them both disappear into the bathroom, but only Wynne came right out. She started to put protein bars from the kitchen in a small brown satchel she had with her now, under her cloak. Adams walked in to get his gear and walked past the bathroom to see Lane drinking thirstily from the toilet. Shaking his head, he got his tactical vest and pack from a locker and put them on, retrieved his suppressed AR. Absently, he checked his holster for his Glock. It was there and secured. He didn't remember recovering it. 2 minutes later, they were down the ramp and away. He had missed her voice. Even if he could not understand her words, it reminded him of birdsong. Adams realized 2 hours later, as they crossed an area that was still green, that they were on an actual path, moving north. Not quite a road, though. Wynne could follow it, even in the most heavily burned areas. His gear included a fly, a small surveillance drone that was integrated with his heads-up display. It patrolled around them and could function as a secure comm relay to the pod and box. The fly revealed on an elevated survey that the strip of land that they were on was about 1 kilometer across with lakes on each side. It was burned almost entirely flat. After the third hour, they had been climbing up toward a ridge, elevation increasing. It was very steep, and Adams looked up at it with an expression of someone that doesn't like to climb. Lane ran ahead. Everything here was burned to cinders. Winds from behind them would have blown the fire up the hills all the faster. The rain had since washed away the ash, and the path was passable and easy to see. Walking now among the large boulders, he became wary. This was the perfect place for a trap. The rocks were all taller than his head, cutting off his line of sight. Box whispered in his mind, "Tony, something isn't right. Lane has disappeared. It has gotten too quiet. Even the birds are hushed here." Adams ordered the fly to be returned and followed them from above. A small window opened in his HUD, showing the fly's point of view. It was rapidly descending and coming up on them from the rear. It was almost too late. Were it not for the fly, Adams would have mistaken the new Tellus Raptor for Wynne's pet Lane. But Lane could be identified from above. On the path ahead, facing off with a larger Tellus, Lane was easy to identify from the asymmetrical scorching of his mane. Adams activated automated targeting and red flagged 8 of the beasts crouched in the boulders around them. He manually changed Wynne and then Lane to the designated friendly, just as the first Tellus attacked. With the ease of practice, he brought his rifle to bear. He fired and was on top of the next target before the first beast's dead body had even crashed to the ground mid-lunge. "Run!" he called to Wynne. She didn't question or hesitate. She ran. It only took a few moments before they were standing behind Lane. Tony's rifle barked and cycled. A huge Tellus facing Lane felled with a bullet through the eye into its brain. On his HUD, he could see them coming from behind like a flood from a broken dam. He turned and his gun began dropping them as he slowly walked backwards. The beasts kept on coming, right over the bodies of their packmates. 11 of them lay dead, nearly choking the path between the rocks. And then he was hit. There had been an overhang in the rocks that concealed a Tellus directly to his left. As he was backing up the path, The beast had struck him hard on his left forearm with its cruel tail spike, so hard that he was knocked to the right and almost dropped his rifle. His arm was laid open to the bone in a deep gash from wrist to elbow. Before Tony could draw his Glock or the Tellus could strike again, Lane crashed into it, clamping its jaws around its neck. Lane's tail hit the other Tellus in the ribs over and over, stabbing deep each time until it no longer moved. Tony pressed his right hand as best he could to close the wound. He didn't feel it yet, but knowing what arterial spray was, he knew it was bad. He had med supplies in his pack, but they would do him no good if more of those things came. "Box, I need a secure spot to fix this," Adams said as he examined the gash. It was a mistake. Wind was suddenly pulling him up the trail to the shelf that backed against the sheer face of the wall above. She pushed him to sit. Without a word, she forced him down as she untied her simple red cord. She wrapped it around his upper arm, and using a green branch she had quickly cut to length, she cruelly tightened the makeshift tourniquet around his upper arm. Quickly and quietly she cut strips from the hem of her cloak to tightly bandage his arm and fashion him a sling. Lane stood guard just below them. When she was done, there was no hesitation. She had Tony back on his feet and moving quickly through the great fissure in the rock face. Lane brought up the rear as they moved. The gap in the cliff they traveled showed a tiny strip of sky above was getting closer as they walked. Tony kept the Glock in his right hand as he watched ahead. Lane was out of sight behind them when they emerged from the crevice into another world. The bluff behind them had stopped the fire. It was lush and green here. In the distance he could see a vine-covered stone tower. A small inlet from the lake helped create part of a moat around the keep wall that surrounded the tower. All was overgrown. It was less than a kilometer away. He knew then that he could make it. They crossed the mossy bridge as his vision was beginning to tunnel. There was a small door to the right of the massive double doors in the keep's wall. The hinges didn't even squeak as they entered and closed the door behind them. Cobblestone courtyard had a running fountain in the center. It was simple but artsy in its own way. With a sphere at the center of the pool, covered with glyphs, the water flowed out of a hole at the top center. A broad sill went all the way around it. Suitable for sitting, Adams took off his sling and his gear and placed it all on the sill before he sat. He opened the side of the pack and withdrew a trauma kit. He pressed the injector to his thigh and it filled his veins with ice. It was as if a cold breeze had blown away the fog that caused the tunnel vision. Wynne was talking constantly now, apparently trying to dissuade him from unwrapping the arm. She helped him in the end. The trauma kit was designed to be used one-handed. He allowed the wound to fall open and then sprayed it full of medicinal nanites. Wynne helped him seal the wound with the medical adhesive and then cleaned the arm with individual towelettes that sizzled to the touch and seemed to eat the blood and dirt. He finally sealed it up with a clear med bandage that he painted on the full length of the wound. Tony took the meds that would quickly stimulate blood production. He was already thirsty. He emptied his canteen and refilled it from the fountain as Wynne watched. With his left arm throbbing and his fever already climbing, he opened a ration bar and offered it to Wynne. She shook her head at him as she lowered a wooden bucket into the water. Lane walked up as if he knew the drill, and she poured the bucket over him again and again. She scrubbed him until all the blood was gone, and she was sure he wasn't injured. She talked the whole time. Tony looked around himself. The walls were made of massive blocks and went up about 10 meters. The wall was about 2 meters thick, based on the arch they entered, and there was a walk all the way around, battlements at the top. Everything was covered with vines. The courtyard was about 30 meters across and overgrown with scrub. All of it was intact but overgrown. The vines and scrub were untouched by the fire. The tower made up the entire east end of the keep. The top was about 30 meters high, higher than the wall. Where the walls met the tower was the only access to the upper part of the wall. "Box, are you seeing this?" Tony asked the air. "Yes. Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" "Do it." No rush. Conserve all the maneuvering thrusters you can, he said. I need sleep. I will be there by dawn, she said. Adams discovered that the tower was empty, except for dry leaves and cobwebs. Wynne lived here alone and occupied a small kitchen off the side of the smallest building. He would later learn that it was a night servant's kitchen. The Fly patrolled and mapped the keep. Tony slept. The next morning, thirst drove Adams out of the small warm room. His canteen was empty, so he headed for the fountain to refill it. Box had landed the black pod so quietly inside the walls that not even Lane had stirred in the pre-dawn. He lay on top of the floor in front of the fireplace's embers. Wynne was nowhere to be seen. The black pod looked like it had belonged there, like it had always been there. The dome of it sat among the tall grasses and struggling saplings. Its ramps came down neatly to the edge of the cobbles and managed to balance architecturally with the tower at the other end. Adams drank an entire canteen and then refilled it again. "Good morning, Box. How are you feeling today?" he said as he walked up the broad staircase to the massive doors at the base of the tower. One of the doors was ajar. When he entered, the avatar of Box was waiting inside. Adams knew he had to be careful talking to Box this way, because he was the only one that could see her via his personal HUD. "I'm feeling much better. You?" As usual, she stood at parade rest, examining the room. "The nanites are going to drive me mad with the itching. The fever isn't too bad, though. I've had worse." He looked at his forearm. The sleeve had been cut away. "This room is really something," Box said. "It's half cathedral and half throne room." It was empty except for a raised dais at the far side with a great stone throne at the top of 30 wide steps. There was no dust, no cobwebs on the finely carved seat. Tony climbed the steps and sat. A light autumn breeze came through 6 tall, high windows that faced the dais. Outside, the wind blew in and the dry leaves stirred. This room was designed around this chair. He was surprised how comfortable it was. The biggest fireplace he had ever seen was directly opposite the throne, across the vast room. It had a carved wooden mantel that must have been a meter thick and 5 meters wide. It was flanked by massive doors. The door on the right must have been covered with vines outside. He had not noticed it from the courtyard. Box waited. She climbed the stairs and sat on the top step. She also faced the 6 tall windows. Sun was beginning to peek over the wall and through the windows. "It'll do." Tony had a new tone in his voice. It was noticeable enough that Box turned her virtual head towards him. The look of confidence on his face showed. He knew the road ahead may be long, but he had trained for it. Just then, as the sun reached him, Wynne entered the room, Lane right behind her. Adams did not say a word as she approached the base of the stairs. She glanced up at him and bowed formally, not setting a foot on the steps. She straightened up and held her head high, looking him straight in the eye. She spoke in English, clearly and slowly. "Lord Keeper Adams, the Raptor." It sounded like a pronouncement. She reached around and took off an enormous bag that had been slung over her back, upending it to dump its contents onto the steps. At first glance, it looked like 12 wickedly sharp daggers. She took a single step back and dropped her chin to her chest. Adams realized as he descended the stairs that they were the tail spikes from the Tellus raptors they had killed the day before. Wynne must have gone back and harvested them. He reached down and lifted the smallest one. It was still longer than a hand's breadth. The spike was incredibly sharp, and the last tailbone made the perfect handle. He lifted her chin with his left hand. She stared at his bruised but healing wound. It was just a scar now. "Thank you." He handed the tail spike to her. He wouldn't know the significance of that gesture until much later. That winter, his collection of tail spikes increased to 23. The Tellus learned to stay away from the keep after that first year. The Tellus were the reason the people also stayed away. The land recovered, and the hunting became better. With Box's help, Tony learned common tongue, and Win learned the high speech. Each of the tail spikes was boiled and cleaned and polished, and Win made a leather wrap for the grip. Each of them was stuck into the underside of the mantle as a trophy. At first it was just to dry the leather of the grips, but there they stayed. Box maintained radio silence, waiting for a retrieval signal that never came. Passive sensors saw one other ship get destroyed by the automated defense grid, but that was the last. There was a war going on, it seemed. Adams remained at his post. They stayed quiet as nuclear bombs destroyed the planet's networks. Years passed, and the world was silent. Refugees found them, bringing tales of mass destruction and chaos on the planet named Ventura. Pilgrims came. Many stayed. If they were brave, they all believed Adams was a keeper, a kind of spiritual leader. Adams let them believe it. He would sit on the throne and answer questions. He adjudicated disputes. It was easy with Box. It was a simple life as he waited. They repaired the keep, planted gardens and orchards and fields. He envied their ignorance of the universe. Blaine lived another 19 years. He became a legend that no one actually believed. That is until they saw him sleeping at Adam's feet in the throne room. Eventually he was cremated with every honor that a keeper would have received. Adams personally tended the fire with Win and collected the ashes for burial. It was then that he found Lane's tail spike. It would not burn. It was larger than any in his collection. After that, he carried it with him always in a sheath Win had made for the purpose. 32 years after Adams's arrival, the entire keep had glass in all the windows. It was alive again. Vines covered the dome of the black pod. 46 adults and 21 children resided inside the keep full time. It was clean and beautiful. Where the forest had once been burned flat was now dotted with farms and even a small village with a tavern. Win and her husband had 4 children and 8 grandchildren. She was the keep's real leader, and the only one that had ever been inside the dome where Adams lived. She was also the only one that noticed that Lord Adams had not aged a day since they had met. Box, will you please tell Keeper Adams that a guest will arrive in a few minutes? He wears the livery of the High Keeper's trackers. Win knew that she could speak directly to Box from anywhere that had line of sight with the vine-covered dome. By the time the hooded figure entered the keep, Adams was waiting in the high seat. As he entered the great hall, instead of approaching the dais right away, as was the custom, the high tracker turned his back to Adams to examine the collection of Tellus raptor blades stuck to the mantle. Box was sitting in her usual spot on the steps just to the right of the throne. "Be very careful with this one," she said to Tony in his HUD. The man turned his head and then lowered his hood, as if he had heard her statement and was responding to it. As the man approached the steps, Adams could see he too wore a huge Tellus blade. The man approached and began to climb the stairs. Another breach of protocol, to climb the steps without invitation. "Hello, Casey. It has been a long time," the man said. Box didn't reply, but stood as Tony stood. Then suddenly Adams recognized him. They both froze. The man was 2 steps from the top, but he was still taller than Adams. "I was about to ask if you were ready to go home." The man looked from Adams to Box and then over his shoulder at a crowd gathering in the courtyard. "I think I am home," Adams said quietly. "I know. Me too." His old friend smiled wide. "I hear you make some fine bourbon here." "You always were thirsty, Barkus." The end. This has been a production of Tannhauser Studios for the Ventura Theater, Science Fiction Radio. Copyright 2018 by Martin Wilsey. All rights reserved.